Hey, my name's Paul. I'm the director of Comfort My People. We're going to continue our podcast, The Journey from Jacob. And this time, we're going to continue to learn about Jacob, his descendants. And now Jacob's name, as we know, if you've been following us, has been changed by God to be Israel. Israel is representative of both the people and the place that God has promised, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and now Jacob. His descendants, though I want to emphasize that soon in this story, Jacob will move off of center stage. We've been following somewhat biographically, and he's a real-life character. He's a part of history, world history, Jewish history, church history, and he has a story of his own, and he will, though, become known in this part of the story slowly, steadily, as one of the three patriarchs, as was his father Isaac and his grandfather Abraham. They're the patriarchs. They're known, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's like a triplet. It's like a trio. It's like a triunity in a sense of what represents the origins of the Hebrew faith, which becomes the Christian faith. And so they're known to be the fathers of the faith. Jacob has a different kind of reputation than Isaac and Jacob because he had a very large family. And we started following the episodes, the goings-on of some of Jacob's sons, the descendants, and we're going to see more of that. The theme that we're going to talk about is, I believe, the most important theme in the Bible regarding humanity. You know, we always say Jesus is central theme. Yeshua is the center of the story. He's the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega, that he is and was and is to come. He's the great I am. Everything proceeds out of the mouth of God. Jesus is the Word of God, and so we're seeing the supremacy of him and why he has to be central theme. Because it isn't about people, although it concerns people, because God uses people to represent him. Remember that we spoke not too long ago about what is a biblical worldview, and people have different worldviews based on their belief system, but the biblical worldview is very common to most believers. I kind of break it down in one way, and it doesn't mean it's the only way or certainly the best way, but it explains in very briefly in short phrases why this is a belief system that is genuine and it's authentic and it has reason to study from a certain perspective in order to maintain the flow of why God would tell this story in the first place. The story of creation, which clearly no one was there from the beginning. So when we talk about the origins of the earth, for instance, the origins of the universe, there's many different opinions, but that usually boils down to the major ones, which is a biblical worldview, a different major religions worldview, or which would mainly be Hindu, Judaism, Judeo-Christian worldview, Buddhist. Those are the big ones, and then you have Islam has its own. And they all have their strange, I would say, very strange, way of explaining the origins. And of course, there's Greek mythology, Roman mythology, which is usually popular and taught in the schools, along with the one that is not in the religious category, but it's in the origins category, which is evolution. Just to let you know, I believe evolution is a huge problem that has been taught as fact, not theory. I don't even think it should be taught as theory because it is so full of holes to any thinking person. Now, I know there's geniuses, so-called called geniuses, they're professors, I know many of them. And, they say you have to be a fool to think otherwise. So I'm not here to clash with that. To me, it's like, it's not worth the effort. And it just makes more division. But honestly, there's no common sense to it. It takes more faith to be an evolutionist than it is to believe the Word of God. God makes it very simple. In fact, he thinks it's so common sense that he only gives not even 2 full chapters to the creation of the universe, because he wants to go into the story about people. People are here. They continue to be here. The creation was a one-time event. Nothing's been recreated except for one concept that has been created anew. And that concept is what we're going to be speaking about. And it's based on the concept that I think is the most important premise of the Bible regarding humanity and the role that humanity plays in God's story. So the story has to begin with the creation. There has to be a belief system that says, this was or was not created, or it just came by chance, or some mythological, battle that went on. But you have to go further than that. Where'd the battle come from? Who are the players? Where's the people? Where are all the material objects that are necessary to create something that never existed before? So this is wrapped up in the thinking of and the premise of a worldview. But for us as believers, we clearly say that, well, God created it. It's simple. He said it. In the beginning, God created the heaven and earth. Why is that an argument? No one else was there. No one could refute it. And it makes a lot of sense as we continue to go on and see how he created, the order he created it. The way before the creation, we know very little information, but we know that there was the world was without form and void. But the Spirit of God hovered over the world. Before it was created, the Spirit of God was there. God was there. And we learn later that God is manifests himself in 3 persons, or 3 emanations from the same being who is God. God the Father, God who is the Creator, God the Son, obviously Messiah, Redeemer, and God the Spirit. God the Spirit is invisible, but we see his activity by what he's done. So the Spirit was hovering over the face of the earth. What does that mean? We don't really know, but that's what God told us. And so there was activity, there's interaction. And it said, when God created, the verbs are plural, as is God's name, Elohim. It's a plural form of the word God. And so is his creation. So here we are, talking about the beginnings. No one can prove it because no one was there. But the other thing is, what purpose does man have here? Because man was created on the 6th day. What's he here for? Well, given the hint that God made man in his image. He was to reflect his image. He was to tend the garden. He was to be fruitful and multiply. God wanted this to continue on through mankind, and mankind being the crown of his creation. He was the last of the created beings on earth, and in the sky and the sea. And he's given this proclamation that after he was created and Eve was formed out of Adam's body, not created from, but formed out of, that this was good. Every day it was good. But when man came along, God looked and said, this is really good, really good. So he's somewhat congratulating himself because everything he had planned to do, his will was accomplished in creation. But it's not long after that, we don't know how long, that something went wrong. And this is where the observation part comes. We start with origin, then purpose, and this is the observation. We don't know that from being there. We know that the story speaks about why we are in the condition we're in. Because when the Spirit of God hovered over creation, the world was without form and void. In Hebrew, it's tohu vabohu, tohu vabohu, which means without form and void. It was somewhat confusing. Balagan is a Hebrew word that means messy. It was kind of a mess. It had no structure, no form to it. But yet the Spirit of God hovered over it. And then when God said, let there be light, things started to open up one after the other. There's a spiritual element behind this physical world that God created. It's critical to know that. And that's why God gave us enough information to know that before the Spirit of God hovered above the earth, there was something else that was going on. And it was without form and void at that point in time, which actually there was no time yet because there was no revolution of the sun, of the earth around the sun, and the rotation of the earth each day, and the moon each month. So all these things would be determinants for time and seasons, but they were yet to be. So there actually was no time. So we're walking into, people, into a system that is a closed system, and it has a time, it has a beginning, and it has an end. So those things are important to remember. But why do I say something went wrong? Well, it doesn't take long to look around. We see that from what we live in. We know that if it was good every day, God finished His creation, says, this is good. This is really good. When He was done with man, wow, this is very good. And we're living in that world. And we don't see the same goodness that God saw initially. So we know something went wrong. The only way we would know what went wrong is if we keep reading and we see the story of the garden, where Adam and Eve were exiled from the garden because God told them to eat anything you want. Enjoy this place. This is for your enjoyment, guys. Adam and Eve. They walked in the garden with Him. Adam in the still of the day. For a long period of time, we don't know how long, before Adam had a helpmeet that was suitable for him. Helpmeet does not mean inferior. It means that together, Adam and Eve were meant to be together and to work together to reflect God's character, His nature, and the way people can relate to each other. Adam and Eve were intended to be that couple. And they were. We don't know how long, but they were, until they weren't. And that's when they decided to eat from the fruit that God made very clear. Don't eat from the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, or else you will fall. You will, literally, it means you will die, but the die means in dying, you will die. So it's not a physical death of immediacy, but it's a dying sense of losing the life that God offered them. Now, this stuff I know we went over earlier, probably a lot earlier, but I think it's necessary to do these things occasionally, because what we're going to dive into now is to see what we observe. The things went drastically wrong. I mean, just think about it, where all these flowers and beauty, fragrances, birds singing, there was no storms, there was no killing, there was no bloodshed, animals talked. We know that because when the serpent talked to Eve, she was not at all surprised that he was speaking. So there's no reason to think that animals, they all talked. They communicated. Adam named them. He was told that was one of his jobs. And so there's so much we don't know, but we can kind of use our sanctified imagination, knowing that God, who created all things, who is incredibly creative and imaginative and capable, that He could do anything. And I think that in the beginning He made it very simple for life to flow in and out of each other's lives. And this river flowed through the garden, and it came in as one river, and it flowed out of the garden in 4 separate rivers. That's a picture of God's presence in this life that we live as believers, that He flows into our life. And He should flow out of our lives into the lives of others, bringing life, because all these rivers and streams, they were teeming with life. Fish and wildlife were living in these waters that was unseen by the natural eye. But God filled everything with such splendor and abundance, and they had enough. They had enough, and yet they wanted more. And that's when sin entered into the world, and something went downhill afterwards. Sin entered through pride, because even though God said not to eat from it, they leaned on an understanding that was deceptively brought into their lives through the serpent, and they listened to him rather than God. They trusted in their own imagination and inclinations and understanding, and that is the clear definition of pride. It's the opposite of humility. It's the opposite of meekness. And they walked into danger, and life has never been the same ever since. So what God called very good became in a decline state, a state of decline, and slow return to chaos and confusion. Let me tell you, we're living in that land now, the land of chaos and confusion. So what was once this perfect place, where birds sang, bees hummed, and the bees began to sting, and the beautiful fragrant roses began to grow thorns. So there was a need for solution, which would have been the next part, which is the next part of the biblical worldview. There needs to be a solution, and I call that portion redemption. The creation needs to be brought back in some way, shape, or form to resemble its original state, and why God, and it has to also explain the story, why God would allow this to happen. So that's the redemption includes man at his best. If for man to be involved in the redemption story, it has to be man at his best, which we'll see doesn't really happen. So there needs to be a redeemer in the process, not just redemption. There needs to be one who heads the charge. And there's a lot that develops over that specific portion of this story of God, because redemption actually becomes the entire story for the next 6,000 years or whatever. And the story ends with vindication. Vindication is not just the solution, but it's bringing the story to a head. God, if you know everything. If you knew everything, why did you allow this to happen? Why did you allow sin to enter the world? Why did you allow all the damages that has occurred since that time when man made his own decisions, and you didn't stop him from making the wrong ones? And then, it's just a continual sense of brokenness. I'm not saying that life is miserable and all that. I'm saying in the midst of a beautiful song, there's a sour note. In the midst of major chords, which are, vibrant and moving, and there's this emotional sorrow of minor keys. So this is the, somewhat of the confluence that takes place in our lives all the time, where we intersect, this beauty, this cyclical sense of things are well and things are not so well, things are well and not so well. And we can get caught up so much in the not so well, or drown in the sense of things have to be well, or I can't live. There's no sense in living. So God has to be vindicated for why he brought free will into the world. And the only way that he will be vindicated is if the people who were given free will exercise it according to God's will at a large enough number to be recognizable. So not only will God be vindicated, but the people who follow him will be vindicated. Those are the believers. The believers in Yeshua, specifically, he's the Redeemer, who gives us a new way of living. He gives us a new heart, a new mind, a right spirit, writes the word of God, the law of God on our hearts and minds that we would do it. And so that's the people that will bring vindication to the creator of all things and the one who made these decisions. So we're at this point now where these descendants of Jacob show up. And last week we told the story about Dinah. It was a horrible story. Terrible. But that's the beginning of the family of Jacob unfolding as descendants. Now, God told Adam and Eve that they were to be fruitful and multiply. That means they were to have children, descendants. All the descendants, though, were going to come through the line of Seth, the third son, because the first two sons couldn't get along together. And here's what I'm getting to. If they couldn't get along together, didn't God know that was going to happen? Of course he did. So why did he let it happen? Because he could have stopped it and it would have been the end of it. No, actually it wouldn't. Because God knows what the end would have been. Because there's no redemption, there's no vindication, and there's no satisfaction, and there's no way of proceeding into the future, which is the world to come yet, which we know very little about, except that it'll be perfect. But in this world, We have to deal with these issues, and the only way we're going to be able to deal with them, it's through a trust relationship with God. That's not something that Adam and Eve modeled very well. So they kind of almost fade out from the conversation completely. When Cain killed his brother Abel, we never hear from Adam again. He didn't step in and say, look what I've done. I should never have allowed this to go this far. And then, but Eve, she took God's promise that there would come a redeemer. There would come one who would proceed from her loins, from her body, from her womb, who would destroy not only the enemy, but the works of the enemy. So from her would come this redeemer one day. And we know, as we read the story into the New Testament, Jesus is that one. He is the seed of the one who was Eve, who gave birth initially to Cain and Abel, and then the blood of Abel cried out for redemption, cried out for justification, cried out because it wasn't supposed to end that way. One brother was not supposed to kill the other brother. It's horrible. So the story goes from God to the interference where things go wrong, drastically wrong, to this redemption story, to, well, what does man have to do with the redemption story if it's going to come through Jesus the Redeemer? Well, the redemption story will not be vindicated as a belief system unless those who believe are justified by the way they act. And that is where this theme comes in. It's called brotherly love. It's the main topic of the Bible because God wanted it to be this way, where brothers who loved one another would be the solution, would lead to the solution of the redemption story and his vindication. So when he told them to multiply, that men had kids. So they had these two kids, didn't work out. Third one is Seth, I said, and she called him Seth because it means appointed. Eve called him Seth, and she had hope that he'd be the Redeemer, but he wasn't. So the story follows the seed, the descendants of Seth, through time, and we go through a lot of time, and we're going to come to where we've already been, and now we're circling back to this man named Abraham at the time, who was called out from Haran, which was a pagan part of the earth, near what we know as Babylon, most likely. And he was called out to follow God into a land that he would show him, and he would show him his purpose. That's when this whole concept, this is the major concept now, which is like two sides of one coin, and it's called the blessing. One side of the coin we talked about is brotherly love. The second side, the opposite side, is the same value because they're the same coin, is the blessing. The blessing to Abraham, and this I know you know, is what was meant to go from Abraham, from Isaac, from Jacob, and Jacob's descendants into the families of the earth. It was going to be God's way of bringing goodwill into all the families of the earth. And this is it was his desire to do it this way. So God told him this initially, but the actual actuation, if that's the right word, of Abraham becoming part of the story, he's given the blessing. Once he follows God into the new land, the promised land that he's giving him, which becomes the land of Israel, he promises in this forever. He promises it to Isaac forever, and he promises it to Jacob forever. However, they're not the only players. And we're just going to touch on this briefly, because when Abraham was given the promise, he was 75 years old, had no kids, and it wasn't until he actually was 100 years old that he had Isaac and his wife Sarah. Sarah was 90 years old. But before that, there was this cunning, coaxing, conniving thing that went on, because Sarah felt that she was told to have a child. She didn't trust God initially. And so she said, here, take my handmaiden, Hagar, who's an Egyptian, and she could be your handmaiden. You can have a child through her, and you'll be satisfied. You have a kid. God kept his promise. So we're not supposed to manipulate God's ways, his teaching, his will, but she did, and that began a huge problem because Hagar, the handmaiden of Sarah, the Egyptian, she was an Egyptian bondwoman, her son was named Ishmael, and Ishmael is literally the patriarch of the Muslim faith, Islam, and he was antagonistic towards Isaac when Isaac was born, but God made it very clear, listen, Ishmael, I did not choose to be the promised seed. I chose Isaac, but you didn't wait. Now you got a problem. We got this enmity going on in the household, and it can't go on. These brothers, if they can't love each other, they can't live together. And so Hagar and Ishmael had to leave the house and premise, but God promised them that they also would have land. Actually, Ishmael was promised way more land than Isaac and Jacob were, and thus we have the Middle East. Muhammad is a descendant of Ishmael. So you see how this picture evolves and how things went wrong. But now God has even more work to do to redeem me, because I got these two brothers, they can't get along. The first two couldn't get along. This two can't get along. And to complicate things worse, the next pair of brothers is Isaac's sons. They're twins, Esau and Jacob. In short, Jacob passes the blessing on to Jacob is passed down the blessing from Isaac. Esau is not. And Esau, there's reasons for that. We won't go deep into it, but Esau is furious over that. He's furious. Why? It says because of the blessing. Because of the blessing. He's furious. And so this blessing that was meant to bring life and life abundant into the families of the earth, it's got dirty hands already. It's like a hot potato, and no one even touches it. And as time goes on, it seems to get smaller and smaller in its vital importance as brothers continue to not get along. And so next time we get together, we're going to speak about Joseph and his brothers. And the story goes on because this is the story of the descendants of Jacob. And we need to see ourselves in this story in order to become a useful advocate for the things of God and his calling on our lives. Because be prepared. You are being prepared to vindicate God, who is on this seat of judgment, and all the earth has accused him for everything. All of humanity, at one point or another, whether it was out loud or in your mind, of why did you let this happen, God? And so God will be vindicated, and it's going to come through brotherly love. This is a cool part of the story. You're a part of it, but you have to come to terms with, really, do I really want to be a part of this? And I think you do. One last word. Comfort my people. The partners that we support in Israel are amazing people. They're the ones that are on the front line serving the gospel to their people. Israel is considered an unreached people group. If you're familiar with global missions, if you're familiar with Matthew 24:14, many global missions hinge on that verse that this gospel of the kingdom must go into all the nations of the world, and then the end will come. There's other verses. There's much in the Bible that needs to be put together as a whole sense of understanding of what that actually means. But the gospel has been going into the nations for hundreds of years through missionaries, and it's some of that story is really good and some is not so good. But part of the story that's very rarely told is, well, what about the Jews? Did they need the gospel sent to them? Well, I'm going to leave you with this. They measure groups that are evangelized, quote unquote, by how many people believe the Bible is real, understand it, have a book in their own language, the Hebrew book, the Bible in their own language. no matter what people group are. I think there's something like 220 people groups. I'm not sure if I'm right or not, but I know it's up there. And a lot of them have been reached. But the most unreached one of all of them, for the longest period of time in history, is, you might find this hard to believe, the Jewish people in the land of Israel. Doesn't make sense. They wrote the Bible. They wrote the New Testament, I think, entirely. Some people say Luke wrote it, portions. I think Luke was Jewish, but that's not important. Why are they so unreached if they play such an important role in writing the Bible, preserving the Bible, being all the prophets that are spoken about in the Bible, the kings in the Bible? Why were all the disciples Jewish and Jesus the Messiah was Jewish, and the land of Israel is where 90% of the story is being told? Why is it possible they're unreached? And that's another story in itself. But our people that we support are so unique and so much of a minority. And they're brothers and sisters in the faith. And I am coming to you not begging for money, but I'm asking you to consider that. Consider, should I be concerned about that? Do I want to play a role in helping to bring the gospel to these people who have preserved it for us to have? And they never had a Bible in their own language until this year? Is that really possible? Is this guy making this up? Well, this is what we support in Israel. And the enemy has kept this so tightly closed because he knows when brothers, and now I'm talking about Jews and Gentiles, get together as one, it's game's up for him. Time's up. Lights out. Because his end is coming soon. Please pray about that and keep in touch with us. Like us on Facebook, on Instagram. We have a YouTube channel. It's Comfort My People at Israel. YouTube, I think it's .com, I'm not sure. But go to our website, comfortmypeople.com, and start browsing around and praying. And I'm going to ask you to consider other things as time goes on to help encourage this message to go out there. So we thank you and bless you. B'Shem Yeshua. Amen.